Commander Nala stared at the assignment pad in her clawed hands, her purple skin darkening with irritation. Another human exchange program. Another waste of her valuable time. The Galactic Council had gone completely mad, she thought, forcing established military powers like the Zephyrian Empire to babysit these newcomers who had barely mastered space travel. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Crix, approached with barely hidden amusement, dancing in his 4 eyes. "Commander, the human delegation has arrived at Docking Bay 7. Should I escort them to the waste disposal unit?" His joke earned snickers from the other officers monitoring the bridge stations. Nala's mandibles clicked in annoyance. "Unfortunately, no council protocols require we treat them as legitimate military representatives." She stood from her command chair, all 7 feet of her imposing frame casting shadows across the metallic floor. "Summon Captain Han Sol to the weapons demonstration facility. Let's get this embarrassment over with quickly." 20 minutes later, Nala found herself face to face with the most unremarkable creature she had ever encountered. Captain Han Sol stood barely 6 feet tall, covered in pale pink flesh instead of proper scales or chitin. His small round eyes lacked the multiple pupils that allowed proper depth perception, and he possessed only 2 arms instead of the standard 4 that any sensible species evolved. But what truly caught her attention was the object slung across his back. It appeared to be some sort of primitive metal tube, roughly the length of his arm with what looked like wooden attachments. The craftsmanship seemed crude, almost handmade, like something her own ancestors might have used thousands of years ago before discovering energy-based weaponry. "Commander Nala," Han Sol said in accented galactic standard, offering what humans apparently called a smile. "Thank you for hosting this cultural exchange. I'm honored to observe Zephyrian military capabilities." Behind Nala, her weapons officers exchanged glances that screamed volumes. Officer Vex actually covered his mouth to suppress laughter. "Sergeant," Thane's tail twitched with barely controlled mirth. Even the usually professional Lieutenant Crix allowed his secondary arms to gesture mockingly at the human's primitive equipment. "That's your weapon?" Nala asked, pointing at the metal contraption. "That wooden stick with metal attached?" Han Sol's expression remained pleasantly neutral. "This is a standard infantry rifle, yes. It has served humanity well for several centuries." He made no move to remove it from his shoulder or explain its function further. Centuries, Nala thought with growing disbelief. The Zephyrians had been using plasma-based energy weapons for over 10,000 years. Their current sidearms could punch holes through starship hulls, while this human carried what appeared to be a museum piece. She wondered if this was some sort of elaborate joke orchestrated by the Council to test her patience. "Very well," she said, deciding to treat this situation with the dignity it clearly didn't deserve. "Follow me to our primary weapons facility. Perhaps observing actual military technology will prove educational for your species." As they walked through the gleaming corridors of the Zephyrian battlecruiser, Nala's officers continued their quiet commentary. She caught fragments of their whispered conversations about primitive projectile weapons, chemical propulsion systems, and speculation about whether humans had even discovered basic energy manipulation. The human walked silently beside her, apparently unbothered by the obvious mockery surrounding him. This was going to be a very long day. The Zephyrian weapons facility stretched out like a metallic cathedral, its polished floors reflecting rows of energy weapons that hummed with barely contained power. Han Sol walked quietly beside Commander Nala, his eyes taking in every detail with the careful attention of someone who understood that knowledge could mean survival. "These are our standard plasma rifles," Nala announced, gesturing toward a rack of sleek crystalline weapons that seemed to glow with inner light. "Each unit can maintain continuous fire for 6 hours without recharging. The targeting computer automatically compensates for distance, wind resistance, atmospheric density, and target movement." Han Sol nodded thoughtfully, stepping closer to examine the elegant curves of the alien weapon. "What's the effective range on these units?" "Effective range?" Nala's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. "Captain, these weapons can accurately eliminate targets at distances exceeding 3 kilometers. The plasma discharge travels at near light speed, making evasion essentially impossible." The human made a small sound of appreciation that seemed genuine. Impressive engineering. How does the targeting system handle multiple moving targets? Observe, Nala said, hefting one of the rifles with practiced ease. The weapon seemed to mold itself to her grip, internal systems automatically adjusting to her physiology. A holographic display materialized above the barrel, showing wind speed, temperature, humidity, and dozens of other environmental factors. She aimed at a distant target that appeared as nothing more than a small dot to Han Sol's eyes. The moment, she squeezed the firing mechanism. A brilliant blue bolt of energy streaked across the range, instantly vaporizing the target in a shower of sparks. The weapon's computer had done all the work, calculating trajectory, environmental factors, and timing in microseconds. The system can engage up to 12 separate targets simultaneously, Nala continued, warming to her demonstration. Each shot is guaranteed accurate within a margin of error, so small it's practically non-existent. Han Sol watched another officer demonstrate a particle beam weapon that literally disintegrated an armored training dummy. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Nala noticed him paying particular attention to power consumption rates and recharge cycles. Fascinating technology, Han Sol said finally. Your civilization has clearly mastered energy manipulation on a level that... He paused, seeming to search for appropriate words. Well, that represents thousands of years of advancement. Lieutenant, Crick stepped forward, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Captain Han Sol, perhaps you could demonstrate your own weapons capabilities. We're quite interested in seeing how human technology compares. The request hung in the air like a challenge. Several officers gathered around, their expressions mixing curiosity with barely concealed anticipation of entertainment. Han Sol's hand moved unconsciously toward the rifle on his back, then stopped. Well, he said slowly, this rifle has an effective range of about 800 meters, maybe a kilometer under ideal conditions. It requires manual targeting, manual range calculation, and manual compensation for environmental factors like wind and humidity. The silence that followed was broken by what sounded suspiciously like a snort from Sergeant Thane. Officer Vex turned away, his shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Even the usually professional Nala found herself struggling to maintain diplomatic composure. 800 meters. Manual targeting. The primitive nature of human technology was even worse than they had imagined. I see, Nala managed, her voice carefully controlled. And the power source for this weapon? Han Sol's expression didn't change. Chemical energy. Small metal projectiles propelled by controlled explosions. This time, several officers couldn't contain their amusement. The idea of using explosions to throw pieces of metal seemed almost comically primitive to beings who routinely manipulated the fundamental forces of the universe. As they moved deeper into the weapons facility, Han Sol's questions became more frequent and increasingly specific. What started as polite curiosity had evolved into something that made Nala's skin crawl with irritation. How do you handle plasma containment during rapid temperature fluctuations? Han Sol asked, examining. A heavy assault cannon that could level small buildings. And what's the failure rate on your magnetic field generators under combat stress? Nala's tail lashed behind her, a clear sign of growing agitation among her species. Our technology is extremely reliable, Captain. We've had centuries to perfect these systems. Of course, Han Sol replied smoothly. But every system has limitations. What happens if your power core gets damaged in battle? Do you have backup targeting systems if the main computer fails? The questions kept coming. How long did it take to manufacture replacement parts? What materials were required for the energy? Cells? Could the weapons function in environments with high electromagnetic interference? Each inquiry felt like a probe, searching for weaknesses in technology that the Zephyrians considered flawless. Lieutenant Crix pulled Nala aside during a brief pause in the tour. Commander, why is he asking so many questions about vulnerabilities? It's almost like he's looking for ways to defeat our weapons. Nala's 4 eyes narrowed as she watched Han Sol, carefully examining the cooling vents on a plasma artillery piece. The human seemed completely absorbed in understanding every detail, his fingers tracing the alien engineering with an almost reverent attention that was somehow more insulting than open mockery would have been. Perhaps, she whispered back. He's trying to understand technology that his species won't achieve for another 1,000 years. But something about Han Sol's demeanor bothered her. Despite carrying what amounted to a historical artifact, despite being surrounded by weapons that could vaporize him before he could blink, the human displayed no signs of feeling outclassed or intimidated. If anything, he seemed increasingly interested, like a scholar discovering fascinating new information rather than a primitive being confronted with superior technology. Your tactical doctrine seems heavily dependent on technological superiority, Han Sol observed, watching a training exercise where Zephyrian soldiers relied entirely on their weapons' computer systems for target acquisition. What happens when you encounter enemies with comparable technology levels? Nala's mandibles clicked sharply. Captain, with respect, that scenario is highly theoretical. Our weapons represent the pinnacle of military development in this sector of the galaxy. Han Sol nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Every weapon system has been the pinnacle until something better comes along. Military history is full of superior forces defeated by opponents who found creative solutions to technological gaps. The casual way he discussed military history rankled Nala more than she cared to admit. Here was a representative of a species that threw metal pellets using controlled explosions, lecturing advanced alien civilizations about warfare. The audacity was breathtaking. "Tell me," she said, her voice carrying an edge that made nearby. Officers look up nervously. "If human technology is so limited, how exactly did your species earn admission to the Galactic Council?" "The requirements are quite stringent." For the first time since arriving, Han Sol's expression shifted slightly. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features before disappearing behind his diplomatic mask. "That's an interesting question, Commander. I suppose the Council saw something in humanity that impressed them enough to grant membership despite our apparent technological limitations." His tone remained perfectly polite, but there was something underneath it that made Nala's scales prickle with unease. Confidence, not the desperate bravado of someone trying to hide weakness, but the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. It was the most unsettling thing she had encountered all day. The evening banquet hall buzzed with conversation and the soft glow of bioluminescent decorations that pulsed in rhythm with Zephyrian music. Han Sol sat quietly at the diplomatic table, politely sampling alien delicacies that probably would have made most humans violently ill. Around him, Zephyrian officers grew increasingly animated as they consumed something that looked like liquid starlight but packed the punch of pure alcohol. Commander Nala found herself drinking more than usual, partly from social obligation and partly from the lingering frustration of Han Sol's endless questions during the facility tour. The human's calm demeanor throughout the day had been like a constant itch she couldn't scratch. Every time she demonstrated superior Zephyrian technology, he simply nodded and asked another probing question, as if their advanced weapons were merely interesting curiosities rather than overwhelming displays of power. "Captain Han Sol," she called out, her voice carrying across the banquet hall louder than diplomatic protocol normally allowed. "I've been thinking about our discussion earlier regarding weapon effectiveness." The conversation around nearby tables quieted as officers turned to listen. Han Sol set down his cup of something that glowed faintly purple and gave Nala his full attention. "Your rifle," Nala continued, feeling emboldened by the alcohol and the encouraging nods from her fellow officers. "With its 800-meter range and manual targeting, I'm curious how it would perform under actual combat conditions." "Lieutenant," Crix leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Commander, are you suggesting a demonstration?" The idea seemed to spread through the room like wildfire. Officers at distant tables craned their necks to hear better. Someone mentioned the Academy's advanced training range. Another voice suggested making it interesting with challenging conditions. "A friendly competition," Nala said, the words flowing more easily with each passing moment. "Tomorrow morning at the Academy range, standard marksmanship trials, but let's make them properly challenging." She began outlining increasingly difficult scenarios, her confidence growing with each proposal. Targets at maximum range, naturally, moving platforms to test tracking ability, Perhaps some adverse weather conditions using the environmental simulators, variable lighting conditions, multiple target engagement. Han Sol listened to each suggestion with the same calm attention he had shown all day. When Nala finished her list of challenges, he was quiet for several long moments, seemingly considering the proposal carefully. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity for cultural exchange," he finally said, that same small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I accept your challenge, Commander." The room erupted in excited chatter. Officers immediately began discussing the specifics of tomorrow's competition, and more importantly, began placing wagers on the outcome. The betting started conservatively, with most officers giving Han Sol credit for potentially hitting stationary targets at close range. "I'll wager 50 credits the human hits less than half the targets," announced Sergeant Thane, his tail swishing with amusement. 50 credits, Officer Vex laughed. "I'll bet 100 he doesn't hit anything beyond 300 meters. The stakes kept climbing as more officers joined in. Some bet on specific scenarios, like whether Han Sol could hit moving targets at all. Others wagered on how quickly he would give up when faced with impossible shots. A few merciful souls bet that he might manage to hit 1 or 2 targets through pure luck. Throughout the escalating excitement, Han Sol remained seated calmly, occasionally sipping his drink and engaging in polite conversation with whoever addressed him directly. If he was concerned about the increasingly confident predictions of his failure, he showed no sign of it. Nala watched him carefully, searching for cracks in his composed facade. Surely the human understood what he had agreed to. Tomorrow's competition would pit primitive projectile technology against targets designed to challenge advanced energy weapons. It would be like bringing a stone club to fight against plasma cannons. Yet Han Sol's expression remained unchanged, that quiet confidence never wavering, as if he knew something the rest of them didn't. The next morning arrived with the pale light of Zephyr Prime's twin suns filtering through the Academy's transparent aluminum windows. Commander Nala stood in her quarters, running final diagnostics on her plasma rifle. The weapon's holographic display showed perfect readings across every system: power cell at maximum capacity, targeting computer operating at peak efficiency, barrel cooling system functioning flawlessly. She smiled with satisfaction as the diagnostic completed in under 30 seconds. Modern Zephyrian weapons were marvels of engineering that required minimal maintenance. The rifle practically took care of itself, with automated systems that cleaned, calibrated, and optimized performance without any input from the user. Down the corridor in the guest quarters, a very different scene was unfolding. Han Sol had risen before dawn and cleared a space on the floor of his assigned room. His rifle lay disassembled before him, broken down into dozens of individual components that were spread across a clean cloth with military precision. Each piece had its designated place, arranged in an order that seemed to follow some internal logic that only he understood. Nala had decided to check on her opponent's preparations, partly out of curiosity and partly to gauge his mental state before the competition. What she discovered through the partially open door made her pause in fascination. The human worked with the focused intensity of a master craftsman. His hands moved with practiced certainty, examining each component under a small handheld light. He checked springs for tension, inspected metal surfaces for wear, and cleaned parts with solvents that filled the room with sharp chemical odors. "Is this really necessary?" Nala asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer as she stepped into the room. Han Sol looked up briefly, then returned to his work. "Every shooter has their pre-competition routine. This rifle has been with me through 7 deployments across 4 different worlds. We know each other well." Nala watched him use what appeared to be primitive measuring tools to check tolerances between moving parts. The precision required seemed absurd when Zephyrian weapons automatically adjusted themselves for optimal performance. Why would anyone choose to manually perform tasks that computers could handle more accurately? "So your weapon requires this much maintenance?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Our rifles perform self-diagnostics and auto-correction continuously." "Different philosophies," Han Sol replied, carefully reassembling the firing mechanism with movements that looked almost ritualistic. How your technology removes the human element from the equation. This approach integrates it. He held up a component that looked like nothing more than a curved piece of metal. To Nala's eyes, it seemed impossibly crude compared to the crystalline perfection of Zephyrian engineering. Yet Hansol examined it with the reverence of someone handling a priceless artifact. This trigger has been adjusted to break at exactly 4 pounds of pressure, he explained, though Nala hadn't asked. The barrel has been hand-lapped to ensure perfect consistency. The stock has been fitted specifically to my body dimensions. Every surface that touches my skin has been shaped and reshaped over thousands of hours of use. Nala found herself oddly mesmerized by the process. There was something almost meditative about the way Hansol worked, each movement deliberate and purposeful. He wasn't simply maintaining a weapon, he was performing what could only be described as a communion with it. "How long does this ritual take?" she asked. "It's not a ritual," Hansol corrected gently, now reassembling the weapon with smooth efficiency. "It's preparation. Understanding your equipment completely means knowing exactly what it's capable of under any conditions." As he worked, he explained each component's function, its limitations, and its interaction with other parts. The level of intimate knowledge he displayed was staggering. While Zephyrian warriors relied on computers to handle such details, this human had memorized every specification of his primitive weapon. Within an hour, the rifle was completely reassembled, cleaned, and ready. Hansol performed several function checks, working the action with practiced motions that produced satisfying mechanical sounds. Nala left the guest quarters feeling oddly unsettled, though she couldn't articulate why. The Academy's championship firing range stretched across nearly 2 kilometers of carefully designed terrain, featuring obstacles, elevation changes, and environmental hazards that had challenged Zephyrian marksmen for generations. Word of the unusual competition had spread throughout the base, drawing spectators who lined the observation platforms with barely contained excitement. Commander Nala stepped up to the firing line, her plasma rifle humming with contained energy. The weapon felt perfectly balanced in her forearms, its bioadaptive grip molding itself to her physiology. Around her neck hung the targeting display that would relay environmental data directly to her optical centers. First target, stationary. "At 800 meters, announced the range officer. "A wind speed variable, humidity at 60%. Nala raised her rifle and immediately the weapon systems came alive. Her targeting display filled with scrolling data streams showing wind direction, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, and dozens of other factors that could affect shot placement. The rifle's computer processed this information in milliseconds, automatically adjusting the plasma discharge parameters for optimal accuracy. A red targeting reticle appeared in her vision, hovering perfectly over the distant target. The computer had done all the calculations. All she needed to do was squeeze the firing mechanism. The brilliant blue bolt of plasma streaked across the range faster than most eyes could follow, striking the target dead center with a satisfying explosion of vaporized metal. The crowd murmured appreciation as the hit registered on the scoring displays. "Target 2 moving platform at 1,000 meters, the range officer called out. Again, Nala's targeting system locked onto the moving target with mechanical precision. The computer predicted the platform's trajectory and calculated the exact firing solution needed to intercept it. Another perfect hit, another pleased rumble from the watching officers. The course continued to escalate in difficulty. Targets appeared at extreme ranges, moved in unpredictable patterns, and were obscured by artificial weather effects generated by the range's environmental systems. Each challenge would have tested the limits of even experienced Zephyrian marksmen, using traditional methods, but Nala wasn't using traditional methods. Her rifle's advanced targeting computer made each shot feel effortless. The weapon compensated for every variable automatically, leaving her free to simply point and shoot. Wind gusts that would have thrown off manual shots were calculated and corrected in real time. Moving targets were tracked and predicted with algorithmic precision. "Final target sequence," announced the range officer. "Multiple moving targets at maximum range, adverse weather conditions." The range's weather generators activated, creating swirling winds and intermittent rain that would have made traditional marksmanship nearly impossible. Through the artificial storm, several targets began moving on independent, erratic paths at distances approaching the absolute limit of the rifle's effective range. Nala's targeting system immediately began tracking all targets simultaneously, calculating firing solutions for each one. The advanced computer identified the optimal engagement sequence to maximize accuracy while minimizing the time between shots. She fired in rapid succession, each plasma bolt guided by perfect mathematical precision. One target after another exploded in brilliant flashes as the computer-guided shots found their marks. The entire sequence took less than 40 seconds. The crowd erupted in enthusiastic approval as the final target disappeared in a shower of sparks. Nala's performance had been flawless, demonstrating the absolute superiority of Zephyrian military technology. Every shot had hit exactly where the computer had calculated it should, with margins of error so small they were practically non-existent. She stepped back from the firing line, her rifle's energy cells showing minimal depletion despite the intensive firing sequence. The weapon's cooling systems had maintained optimal temperature throughout the exercise, and all diagnostics showed perfect operational status. Lieutenant Crix approached with undisguised admiration. "Commander, that was exceptional. Shooting, even by Academy standards. 17 targets in adverse conditions, all perfect hits." Nala accepted the congratulations with appropriate modesty, though internally she felt considerable satisfaction. The demonstration had showcased exactly why the Zephyrian Empire maintained military superiority throughout this sector of the galaxy. Their technology eliminated human error from the equation, replacing uncertainty with mathematical certainty. Now it was Han Solo's turn. Han Solo walked to the firing line with unhurried steps, his primitive rifle cradled in his arms like he was carrying an old friend. The moment his boots touched the designated mark, something fundamental changed about him. The polite diplomat who had spent yesterday asking endless questions simply vanished, replaced by someone entirely different. His posture shifted into perfect alignment, every muscle in his body settling into position with practiced precision. His breathing slowed and deepened, following a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with some internal clock. When he raised the rifle to his shoulder, the movement was so fluid it looked like the weapon was becoming part of his body rather than being held by it. The first target appeared at 800 meters, the same distance where Nala had begun her demonstration. But where she had relied on her rifle's computer to calculate wind speed, humidity and atmospheric conditions, Han Solo simply stood still for several long seconds, his eyes focused on something the Zephyrian observers couldn't see. He was reading the environment itself. A slight movement of grass in the distance told him wind direction at the target. The way heat waves shimmered told him about temperature variations that would affect his bullet's flight path. He even seemed to account for the planet's rotation, making minute adjustments that looked meaningless to observers, but were actually compensating for forces that would pull his shot off target during its flight time. When he finally fired, the sound was nothing like the brilliant energy discharge of Zephyrian weapons. It was a sharp crack that echoed across the range, followed by the whistle of a small metal projectile traveling at tremendous speed. A split second later, the distant target rang with the distinctive sound of metal striking metal. Perfect center. Hit! The crowd of watching officers fell silent. Several checked the range displays to confirm what they had witnessed. The human had hit the same target that required Nala's advanced computer systems to engage, using nothing but his own eyes and judgment. "Target 2 moving platform at 1,000 meters, called the range officer, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. Han Solo's rifle tracked the moving target with mechanical smoothness. But unlike Nala's computer-assisted weapon, he wasn't following where the target was. He was aiming at empty space, calculating in his head where the target would be when his bullet arrived. The mathematical complexity of such a shot should have been impossible for biological computation. He fired once. The bullet traced an arc through the air that seemed to bend reality itself, intercepting the moving platform at exactly the right moment and place. Another perfect hit. Murmurs began rippling through the crowd of observers. Officers who had been joking about primitive human technology now watched with growing attention. Some pulled out recording devices to document what they were witnessing. The range officer continued calling increasingly difficult shots, targets at distances where atmospheric effects should have made accurate shooting impossible. Moving targets, following unpredictable patterns, shots that required compensation for wind variations that changed during the bullet's flight time. Each time, Hansol would study the target for several seconds, his eyes seemingly gathering information that no Zephyrian computer could process. Then he would make minute adjustments to his rifle, movements so small they were barely visible, but apparently crucial to his calculations. Each shot was deliberate, methodical, and impossibly precise. At 1,500 meters, well beyond the effective range of most Zephyrian energy weapons, he continued hitting targets that appeared as tiny dots to unaugmented vision. At that distance, his bullets were fighting gravity, air resistance, wind drift, and even the Coriolis effect from planetary rotation. Yet every shot found its mark with accuracy that seemed to defy physics. The watching crowd had gone completely quiet now, their earlier amusement replaced by something approaching awe. They were witnessing shooting that transcended technology, demonstrating capabilities that their most advanced computers could barely match, and Hansol made it look effortless. The range officer's voice cracked slightly as he announced the final challenge. Ultimate test sequence, 2 targets, mobile platforms at 950 meters, crosswind conditions with variable gusts up to 40 kilometers per hour. The weather generators roared to life, creating swirling wind patterns that made the range flags dance wildly in different directions. Dust and debris kicked up from the ground, creating a chaotic environment that would challenge even the most advanced targeting computers. The 2 target platforms began moving on separate courses, weaving unpredictably through the artificial storm. At this distance, the targets looked like tiny black dots dancing against the horizon. Even with binoculars, most observers could barely make them out through the swirling dust and intermittent rain that the weather system generated. The wind howled across the range, creating sound that would mask audio cues that some marksmen used to judge conditions. Hansol stood at the firing line for a full minute, completely motionless except for his eyes. He seemed to be reading the chaos itself, watching patterns in the wind that were invisible to everyone else. His breathing had slowed to an almost meditative rhythm, each breath deep and controlled. Then he dropped into a shooting position that made several Zephyrian observers wince. His body folded into an arrangement that looked impossibly uncomfortable, with joints bent at angles that seemed to strain against natural limitations. But every part of his position served a purpose, creating the most stable platform possible. For his weapon, his left elbow found purchase on the ground, creating a solid foundation. His right shoulder aligned perfectly behind the rifle's stock. His legs spread wide, distributing weight and creating balance points that would resist the buffeting wind. Even his head position was precisely calculated, bringing his eye into perfect alignment with the rifle's sights. The first target continued its erratic movement pattern, disappearing and reappearing through the artificial weather. Hansol tracked it with minute movements of his rifle, but he wasn't following the target's current position. His aim point was offset, leading the target by a distance that seemed impossibly precise given the chaotic conditions. He held his breath, and in that moment of absolute stillness, fired. The crack of the rifle was almost lost in the howling wind, but the distant ring of metal on metal cut through the storm like a bell. The first target had been hit dead center, while moving at full speed through conditions that would have defeated most technological solutions. Without changing position, Hansol began tracking the second target. This platform was following a different course entirely, moving at a different speed and facing different wind conditions. The mathematical complexity of calculating its interception point while compensating for all environmental factors should have required supercomputer processing power instead. Hansol simply watched, his eyes gathering information that his brain processed with efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Wind direction at various points along the bullet's path, the target's acceleration and deceleration patterns, even minute changes in atmospheric pressure that would affect trajectory. He made a tiny adjustment to his aim, barely visible movement that compensated for factors that monitoring equipment hadn't even detected yet. Then he fired again. The second, Shot traced its invisible arc through the swirling wind and dust, fighting against forces that tried to push it off course. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the only sounds were wind and the fading echo of the rifle's report. Then came the sharp ring of another perfect hit. The range monitoring systems immediately began displaying confirmation data that made several officers stare in disbelief. Both targets had been struck within millimeters of perfect center, despite conditions that would have challenged the most advanced targeting computers in the Zephyrian arsenal. Han Sol remained in position for several more seconds, then slowly rose to his feet. He cleared his rifle with practiced motions and slung it across his shoulder, his expression returning to the same calm, diplomatic mask he had worn throughout his visit. The silence stretched across the range like a physical presence. The silence that settled over the academy range felt heavy, like the moment before thunder breaks after lightning. Hundreds of Zephyrian officers stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the impact displays that showed two perfect bullseyes at nearly impossible distances. The wind generators had shut down, leaving only the soft hum of monitoring equipment and the distant sounds of normal base operations. Commander Nala found herself staring at the readouts, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. The targeting data was unmistakable. Both shots had struck within 2 millimeters of perfect center, despite conditions that would have challenged their most sophisticated weapon systems. The computer analysis showed bullet trajectories that compensated for wind variations, atmospheric density changes, and even the slight planetary rotation effects that most shooters never considered. How? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, carrying across the quiet range with unexpected volume. Han Sol had been checking his rifle one final time, ensuring it was properly cleared and safe. At her question, he looked up with that same calm expression he had maintained throughout his visit. But now Nala could see something different in his eyes, a depth of knowledge and experience that she had completely missed before. "Commander," Han Sol said, walking over to where she stood beside the monitoring station, "may I ask you something? When you fire your plasma rifle, what are you actually doing?" The question caught Nala off guard. "I'm engaging targets with precision. Energy discharge, obviously. But what are you personally contributing to that process?" Han Sol pressed gently. "Your weapon's computer calculates wind speed, humidity, atmospheric pressure, target movement, and dozens of other factors. It adjusts the plasma discharge automatically and guides the shot to its target. What part of that accuracy comes from you?" Nala's mandibles clicked with irritation. "The computer enhances natural ability. It doesn't replace skill entirely." Han Sol nodded respectfully. "I'm not questioning Zephyrian marksmanship, Commander. Your military has achieved something remarkable by removing uncertainty from combat shooting. But we took a different path." He held up his rifle, the weapon that had seemed so primitive just hours earlier. Now it looked different somehow, less like an antique and more like a precision instrument that had been refined across centuries of development. "This rifle hasn't changed much in the last 300 years, Han Sol continued. "Same basic operating principles, same fundamental design. We perfected the engineering and then stopped, because the weapon itself was never the limiting factor." Lieutenant Crix stepped closer, his curiosity overcoming diplomatic protocol. "Then what was?" "The person behind it," Han Sol replied simply. "Every human soldier spends years learning to read wind patterns by watching grass move or feeling air pressure on their skin. We memorize ballistic tables until we can calculate bullet drop and drift in our heads. We train until we can estimate range by eye within meters of accuracy." He gestured toward the distant targets, now barely visible without magnification. "Those shots required me to account for wind speed at multiple points along the bullet's path, temperature gradients that would affect air density, humidity changes, and even the rotation of your planet. Your computers can do those calculations faster and more accurately than any biological mind." "Then how did you match our technology?" Sergeant Thane asked, his voice carrying genuine confusion. Han Sol smiled, and for the first time since arriving, it looked completely genuine. "Because I wasn't trying to match your technology, Sergeant. I was doing something entirely different. Your computers calculate the perfect shot based on current conditions. But I was reading the environment itself. understanding how all those factors interact and change from moment to moment. The implications of his words began sinking in around the assembled crowd. Officer Vex spoke up hesitantly. "You mean you can adapt to changing conditions faster than our targeting systems?" "Not faster," Han Sol corrected, "but more intuitively. Your technology gives you perfect accuracy under measured conditions. Human training gives us the ability to succeed when conditions are unknown, changing, or when technology fails." Commander Nala felt something cold settling in her stomach as understanding began to dawn. "Captain Han Sol, what you demonstrated today, is this typical for human military personnel?" "This is standard infantry qualification, Commander. Our specialized marksmen achieve considerably greater precision." The weight of that statement hit the crowd like a physical blow. Standard qualification. What they had witnessed wasn't the peak of human marksmanship capability, it was the baseline, expectation for ordinary soldiers. Nala finally understood why humanity had been admitted to the Galactic Council despite their apparently primitive technology. The Council hadn't been granting membership out of charity or political maneuvering. They had recognized something that the Zephyrian Empire had completely missed. Humanity had achieved through discipline, training, and sheer determination what other species required advanced technology to accomplish, and if their technology ever failed, or if they faced enemies with comparable equipment, they would still have capabilities that no computer could replicate. They had turned their soldiers into living weapon systems that couldn't be jammed, hacked, or disabled.